Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for joining us for our report launch, as well as hopefully a provocative discussion of refugees, migrants, and the food insecure in that country that nobody knows called Djibouti. This is our report, which is stuck in limbo. I think it could just be called stuck. For anyone who looks at issues with people on the move, you start to learn quickly, well, this is a new area for me, but that they truly are stuck. And I think that was a really apt title that we chose. I wanted to open this just a little bit to talk about why we chose to do this. My name is Kimberly Flowers, and I'm the Director of Global Food Security here at CSIS. And as I looked about topics and things that were happening in the world today, I wanted to sort of do something a bit out of the norm. We tend to look more at the U.S. government's role in long-term agricultural development and nutrition programs. But I really wanted to try to link in more on food insecurity issues in areas that aren't as explored. Very grateful to have worked with Shannon Green and our CSIS Human Rights Initiative for this project. And when we were looking at this, we knew we would come at it with our respective lenses. I was really interested as we settled in on the Horn of Africa and settled in on Yemen. We both felt that Yemen doesn't quite get the attention it deserves as a conflict, but wanted to see whether food insecurity, was a trigger for people to move and flee from their homes. And what's the food security status and daily diets for someone when they're on the move, much less when they're stuck in these places, whether, again, they're refugees fleeing from war or whether they're migrants looking for new economic opportunities. And so as we thought through and talked with stakeholders and held roundtables, we sort of settled in on Djibouti, which is a country that many people aren't quite aware of. If you're not sure where it is, look on page 7 in the report. There's a nice map that also shows you. I love maps, I love visuals. But I love this map because it also shows a sort of complex dance between all the movements of people in this volatile region. And why Djibouti? Well, it was kind of simple as we sort of drilled down, because Djibouti is this pretty stable place in a very volatile region, right? I mean, look at its neighbors. You have Yemen, you have Somalia, both that are headed towards famine conditions this year. And it's a country that really opens its arms to try to welcome people in. But it has its own food insecurity issues. 90% of its food is imported. They've got pockets of severe malnutrition and chronic insecurity in its own borders. And so how does it still meet the needs of its people when its limited resources are stretched even more? We also, of course, were interested in the number of displaced persons today. We all know the statistics, I don't have to go there, but how the international community is responding in a time of stretched budgets, in a time that a very true fear and right fear that budgets are going to be cut in our current political environment and what that means. And we really wanted to explore that as we, again, talked with stakeholders, went out to the field, and then ultimately Shannon and Julie, my colleagues, wrote this great report, which we'll discuss more today. Shannon, as the moderator and with the panel, will go into details about our findings of the report, but I just wanted to touch on some high-level issues on why we've chosen this and why Djibouti. Before I wrap up, I also want to just thank my CSIS colleague, Julie. She's at the back, of course, troubleshooting. Julie has been instrumental in this, from dealing with logistics for her first field travel, as well as helping Shannon and I along the way to keep all the pieces together. So very thankful for you, Julie. To me, this is the beginning of hopefully multiple partnerships between our work on food security and work in human rights here at CSIS, because certainly many of our interests, passions, and great ideas intersect. So Shannon, over to you.
Kieran, why don't you sit here? Debbie. Great. Well, I want to join Kimberly in welcoming all of you to CSIS for what I think will be a very interesting and important conversation. As Kimberly mentioned, we chose Djibouti as our case study because in many ways it presents a microcosm of the challenges faced by frontline countries that host both a mix of refugees and migrants. Djibouti's location has made it a primary destination for many refugees and migrants fleeing from insecurity, endemic poverty, and persecution in the Horn of Africa, and most recently from Yemen. With a net migration of 6 migrants per 1,000 people, more people are entering Djibouti on an annual basis than leaving. And you have to keep in mind that this is a tiny country of about 900,000 people. So that represents quite a significant proportion of the population. That said, like most frontline countries, Djibouti faces its own challenges, including chronic food insecurity, which Kimberly talked about, high levels of debt, and widespread poverty. And this makes it extremely vulnerable to the additional pressures of hosting migrants and refugees. In addition, migrants traversing the country face a number of protection issues ranging from physical abuse, gender-based violence, arbitrary detention, and trafficking. And because Djibouti is a politically closed country, it can be very difficult to discuss these issues out in the open. When it comes to refugees, Djibouti is understandably very proud of its open door policy and the fact that it has welcomed refugees for many generations, including nearly 26,000 people who currently have refugee status in the country. Most of them are from Somalia, but as I mentioned, in the past 2 years, more have been coming from Yemen. That said, the government and its international and local partners really do face some significant challenges trying to meet the various needs of all of these different populations residing in and traversing the country. The lives of the Yemeni refugees that we interviewed are very difficult. They're very different from what they experienced in their home countries. The types of food that are available are limited, prices are much higher, and despite some familial and cultural ties, they really felt marginalized, underserved, and pretty desperate, to be honest. They talked about feeling like they were in jail or some sort of purgatory. The Somali refugees and Ethiopian asylum seekers in the south live in poor, overcrowded conditions. Many of them have been there since 1978, so for an extraordinarily long time, with really no prospects of going home or being resettled. So what we basically were uncovering is the fact that this situation requires solutions above and beyond what the government and the humanitarian assistant community is able to do. We wanted to think about ways to sort of break this endless limbo or situation of being stuck in this environment with no prospects of returning home or sort of moving on, the sense that people were just kind of in this no man's land, some of them for an entire generation or more. So we crafted country-specific recommendations, but we thought that some of these recommendations would be applicable to other countries in similar circumstances. The recommendations are, I think there's 5 of them. The first is, number one, that the government needs to expand the free flow of independent, credible, and verifiable data and information. So because of the closed environment that I mentioned, there is a lack of reliable data and a reluctance to discuss sensitive topics related to refugees and migrants. And that makes it very difficult for partners to execute a timely and effective response. So we're basically saying, if you want to improve the response to these issues within Djibouti, the government needs to loosen restrictions on independent journalists and allow the media to cover refugee and migrant issues without fear of reprisal. The second is that the international community and the Djiboutian government need to create meaningful pathways for integration and advancement. So like in many other situations, the refugee crisis in Djibouti tends to provoke a reactive response or an emergency response. But this is despite the fact that people have been there for prolonged periods and sort of this situation of stasis. So what we're essentially saying is the government has gone a long ways in making commitments to open up the education system to refugees and allowing refugees to legally work. But we are saying that the government donors and aid agencies should go beyond those commitments, offering opportunities for workforce development, seed funding for microcredit, skills building, scholarships to secondary and tertiary educational institutions, and other opportunities for people to start to build a meaningful life outside of the refugee camp. Third, we called on the government to scale up mutually beneficial economic initiatives. In other words, you do have these populations within Djibouti that have a lot of capabilities and a lot of skills that could be harnessed. For example, there was an interesting project being carried out by the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries in Obak in which they were using Yemeni fishermen who were quite skilled to teach Djiboutians how to fish. And that had the potential of both improving livelihoods for Yemeni refugees as well as the Djiboutians who were being taught to fish, as well as the food security of both populations. So we're saying those kinds of interesting pilot opportunities should be explored further and expanded upon. And then finally, Djibouti hosts many militaries, including the US military, that are to some degree integrated into society, but they're not a part of the humanitarian operations. And their logistical capabilities are not being used to serve the most vulnerable populations in Djibouti. So we're essentially saying, where appropriate, those militaries should assist in delivering humanitarian aid, but they should also expand training for at-sea rescue operations, because refugees are being dumped in the Red Sea without any notice, and the Djiboutian Coast Guard doesn't yet have the capability to conduct those kinds of risky rescue operations. And then finally, we were looking at the fact that despite a really severe famine, despite a really severe drought in Ethiopia, by and large, we heard that Ethiopian migrants weren't coming to Djibouti because they were suffering from the drought. They were coming in search of economic opportunities, by and large, and traversing through Djibouti to get to the Gulf countries or to North Africa. And we talked to a lot of people who said that was because Ethiopia has invested in a social safety net program. So we were essentially saying that Djibouti and other countries could really learn a lot from Ethiopia's approach in addressing resilience so that people don't feel forced to move because of food insecurity. So those were the major recommendations. They can all be found in the report that hopefully you all picked up when you came in. And here to explore these issues further with us today, we have a really fantastic panel. We have Kieran Donnelly from the International Rescue Committee, where he serves as a Senior Vice President for International Programs. And he's held numerous other positions at IRC, which you can read about in the handout. Next to him, we have Deborah Sadie, who's the Vice President for Public Policy at the World Food Program USA. Deborah has spent the past 22 years working with the United Nations in various capabilities, and obviously brings a lot of expertise to bear on these questions. And finally, Jeremy Konijn-Dijk, I hope I said that correctly, who is currently a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development. Jeremy previously served as the director of USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance from September 2013 to January of 2017. So we have a really wonderful panel with diverse experiences. And what I thought we would do is just start by asking them a couple opening questions to get the conversation started, and then we'll eventually open it up to you in the audience. So first, Kieran, let's start with you. In your role at IRC, how have you seen the needs and vulnerabilities of migrants and refugees evolve? And what do organizations like IRC need from their partners on the ground, from the US government, and from the international community to respond to what is really an unprecedented refugee crisis right now?
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks for the invitation to be here today, and congratulations on the report. I think the choice of Djibouti in some ways was really an insightful and inspired choice for focusing on these issues, because it allows us to both think about a country that doesn't get the attention it should, and there are far too many of those, of course, but it also really does provide insight into some of the global themes and issues that we're all grappling with. And IRC works in the region around Djibouti. We don't work in Djibouti itself, but we're in Somalia, we're in Yemen, where we've doubled our program recently. But I was in Jordan and Lebanon last week, and reading the report on the plane on the way back, it really struck me just how many of the issues that come out in the report resonated with conversations I've been having with our staff in Amman and in Beirut. I met with the team leader for our program in Libya last night, and again, the resonance of some of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of migrants and refugees and how best to serve them, provide assistance, but maintain standards of protection really came through. Something that came out in the report, which we all know but don't, I think about that often, is this is now we're talking about a global refugee, a global migration crisis, but in a place like Djibouti or in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel or in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, people have been moving en masse for generations, for centuries. They've been using the same routes, and by and large they've been moving for many of the same reasons. So the fact that now we're talking about a global refugee and migration crisis has me wondering, what's changed and what's different. And I think some combination of the tragedy in Syria, the drama of Europe's response, increased numbers of disasters and people on the move across the board, the visibility and access to that we have, the political response. There's a combination there that has really brought this to the forefront of all of our thinking and forced us to challenge, I think, some of the inherited assumptions about what it means to provide humanitarian assistance to people on the move, to refugees. We're an organization that was founded to help people fleeing from displacement in Germany in the 30s and have prided ourselves on serving refugees. But now we're grappling with questions about migrants and how do we do that, whether it's in Lesbos or Libya or in Yemen or Somalia or wherever we're working. And it really feels very acutely that the policy and operational responses we have feel like an inadequate toolkit. It feels like insufficient funding is forcing us into a kind of grotesque competition across crises for attention and for money. And the politics behind this, particularly in the US, particularly in Europe and the European Union, the UK, is clouding our vision and not allowing us to really think through what's the smart, pragmatic policy choice and what's the right policy choice in what we do. For me, for IRC, I think part of the answer has to be going back to first principles and humanitarian principles, and remembering that the first humanitarian principle is humanity. And taxonomies and mandates and missions and frameworks and so on are really important. But to the extent that we get paralyzed and caught up in discussions around migrants versus refugees and secondary displacement and so on, we lose track of the kind of lived reality of people whose motivations are diverse, whose self-identification may not fit any of our categories, and whose needs and priorities will shift and change as they move through their journeys. And so I think it's really important for us to find ways to put that lived reality of people at the center of our thinking as we define policy and programming responses. Recognizing the rights that people have, recognizing their vulnerabilities, their needs, and of course their agency and the role that they can play in finding solutions. And so that means recognizing that regardless of legal status, migrants, refugees, these are all people, they're in vulnerable situations, they need assistance. But I don't mean to say that status is irrelevant and unimportant. And I think first and foremost, we have to recognize the significant progress that we've made in gaining recognition and acceptance for the protection status of refugees. And I think there would be significant risks in throwing that debate open. But we also need to find a way to communicate in a generally accepted way the kind of idea that people who don't fit the refugee status definition still have incontrovertible, inalienable rights and needs of protection, and we need to find ways to meet that. And so when we work with host governments, recognizing their legitimate concerns around security and around economic concerns, we still need to find ways to move beyond some of the old models. And this comes through very clearly in the report that for all the policy think tanks and policy operations teams in NGOs and donors and so on that we talk about cash, we talk about urban programming, there's still a lot of the old way of working, warehousing of refugees, put people in camps. And again, you see this in the Middle East, you see it in Libya, you see it in Djibouti. It comes through very clearly in the report. We have to move out of that paradigm. We have to make sure that the benefits are distributed beyond the specific target populations that we're working in so people can reap that benefit locally, recognizing, again, as the report points out, that host communities are often more vulnerable or as vulnerable as the people we're trying to serve. And for me, keeping that protection, the idea of protection standards that need to be met central to that is really important. And when we think about a couple of words on the US and EU before closing, when we think about what we need from the US and the EU, or from kind of world leaders in that regard, first it's about doing no harm. I think it's about recognizing that an emotional reaction and politics driven by emotion aren't necessarily going to lead to effective policy. So when we think about managing migration, stopping boats, turning them back, dumping people in the water, building fences, that's not going to stop people coming. Interdiction hasn't stopped drugs coming. I don't know why we think it's going to stop people coming. But then beyond doing no harm, I think let's think about how we can do some good. And the idea of compacts with host country governments, that can focus on livelihoods, that can focus on integration, that can focus on social cohesion. I think there's real potential in those ideas. But again, to bring it back to the theme, we have to put protection at the center of that, and there has to be accountability for meeting protection standards as part of that. We have to recognize the intersections between poverty and fragility and conflict, and not look just for short-term gains or short-term wins that are not going to lead to long-term transformation. And we have to remember that the world is watching. The world is watching what we say, the world is watching what we do, and it's absolutely not coincidental that you have governments in Africa and governments in the Middle East who are talking about sending refugees back, talking about deterring migration, talking about or through their actions demonstrating kind of refoulement by proxy, increasing administrative barriers. We have to be an example through not just our own words and policies, but through our actions and the funding and so on that we deliver.
Yeah, I mean, on that point on interdiction, I think one of the things that we found is that people's desires and hopes are so strong that despite all of the obstacles, despite the sensitization campaigns, despite the fact that they've tried and failed, people will keep trying if they think that there's something better for them beyond the horizon. I think that that longing was so strong that it was hard to imagine a situation where you could ever just stop migration or stop people fleeing if they were under tremendous pressure.
Thing.
Yeah. So Debbie, let's turn to you. I mean, a lot of what we were talking about in the report is about prevention in a sense. How do you address needs at the point of origin so that people don't feel sort of forced to move on? So I was hoping you could shed some light on one of the central questions that we were investigating, which is, to what extent is food security a factor in migration and displacement? And then what are some innovative ways that you have seen countries, along with their partners, try to make communities more resilient so that they don't feel forced at the first sign of trouble when it comes to food security or drought?
Well, thank you. And I'd like to also thank CSIS for hosting this event. And I would agree that, as Karen had said, the choice of Djibouti is very timely. I think it does open the door to conversations on a broad range of issues. And certainly, just to say, from the point of view of current famine situations in the world, famine risk situations in the world, Djibouti plays a particularly important part because, as you mentioned in the report, there's a reference to the logistics hub which is there. And when that new hub was opened last year, it was already recognized at that time that Djibouti was actually serving WFP in assisting 1 out of 4 people globally. And I think that has only grown over time. And in fact, we have the famine declared in South Sudan, but with the imminent risk in Somalia and Yemen, and just without a formal declaration of famine in either of those countries, I think it's without dispute that the actual conditions are famine-like, and the extreme food security that people are feeling is really in need of urgent assistance. So basically, Djibouti serves as the transshipment point for World Food Program for its operations in Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and of course is the direct route for Ethiopia, which again hosting very large numbers of refugees and experiencing serious drought. So on the question of food security being a factor in terms of displacement and migration, I mean, I think that we would certainly want to recognize that as displacement occurs, particularly refugee displacement, there's the loss of livelihood, there's the loss of assets, loss of disruption to markets, to trade, to all of the basic ingredients that can help to make people food secure. As they're displaced and as they're arriving in a host country, the points that have been made already, particularly if you're talking about arrival in a country like Djibouti, with extreme food insecurity and poverty already, the ability for Djibouti to receive those people also needs to be balanced with meeting the needs of their own populations. So I think the conversation that hopefully we can delve into a little bit more later about how one is able to meet the food security needs of displaced populations while also addressing the needs of the host populations is so central. I mean, because to fail to do that is also to risk exacerbating tensions with local populations, and it can just kind of spiral downward from there. But the reality is that to meet the needs of refugees or migrants, I mean, the food has to be there, the funding has to be there. So whether it's food in kind that has been provided, or whether it's the ability to use cash to tap into local markets to purchase food, or whether it's giving vouchers or cash to displaced populations, the reality is that not only are we in a world where there are extreme food insecurity crises playing out, but also severe underfunding of the resources that are needed. And of course, addressing a famine type situation is about food, but it's also about water, it's about sanitation, it's about access to proper medical care. So the degree to which there are multi-sectoral approaches, and I know that people probably there's a danger of glazing over a little bit when one talks about the relief development, humanitarian development divide. We have been talking about this for decades also, and there's some encouraging news on that front. I mean, I think that when you look at a Jordan or a Lebanon and the host compacts, the engagement of the World Bank, the degree to which a number of major donors and actual humanitarian organizations have also evolved to really try to think about how more integrated approaches can take place, is all positive. But the reality is that up to now, some of those innovations are while they might be unrolling in certain countries or being rolled out in certain countries, they're certainly not across the board. And I think that one only has to look at the Horn of Africa again, where at the moment, I believe the number of refugees probably exceeds or is close to 2 million. When one looks at, I think, 800,000, I mean, I'm counting East Africa really in there, but with the regional spillover, Uganda hosting around 800,000, I believe, Ethiopia around 700,000 refugees, Kenya, I don't know what the actual numbers are now, but traditionally that is, or recently it's been around 500,000. I don't think there's been the same level of support provided to those host governments to really be able to ensure that not only are the refugee needs being met, but also that the poverty indicators and food security needs of their own populations are being addressed. So again, I go back to this point about it's not really an either or. It's not just that resources are needed to meet the populations that have arrived in a particular place, but one also has to look at where they have arrived and what are the needs there. I would also just perhaps mention that, also in the Horn of Africa, climate change is such a factor and has contributed to food insecurity. And I believe that the average number of people who are displaced due to climate-related events is around 22 million people a year globally. So that factor also certainly has to be incorporated or thought through when one is coming up with integrated approaches. I would say that I think there has been a real effort. I mean, the Global Alliance in the Horn of Africa to address drought and build resilience has been in motion for at least 5 or 6 years. USAID has played a really critical role in that. And I think that the important part of that is it's supporting national frameworks with regional support, but it really is looking at the more inclusive set of activities. So I would just perhaps highlight that. And maybe just on the point of migrants, if I could say, WFP had actually been working with IOM in Central America and undertook a study called Hunger Without Borders, and it was trying to get at this issue of to what degree is food insecurity a factor in terms of people migrating. And they did find that there was a very clear link. So it's not just about in search of more economic opportunities, but the food insecurity can also be a real driver toward displacement.
That's actually a great segue to Jeremy. Jeremy, Kieran and Debbie have both described a situation that's very complex, potentially getting worse due to a number of factors, including climate change, and the need to sort of start to think about a new paradigm. As the former director of OFTA, I was hoping you could help us understand how the US government traditionally has approached mass displacement and humanitarian emergencies, and then where you think we need to go given the scale of the challenge today.
Great, yeah, absolutely. And so thanks as well to CSIS for inviting us all here. I think this is a really timely report. And it does nicely highlight some of the broader challenges that the system faces. And Kieran captured it well. We have a humanitarian industry that today is dealing with modern problems through the lens of 20 or 30 years ago and the status and the categories and the sectors and so on that don't necessarily make a lot of sense in the environments where we see humanitarian need today, if they ever did make sense, frankly. And I think of it, and this is heavily informed by some experiences I had while I was at AID, I think of it as a supply-driven model versus a demand-driven model. You know, we have a humanitarian system or humanitarian industry, and calling it a system is maybe generous because it implies design. It's not designed. We have a humanitarian industry that really is supply-driven in how it provides assistance. It is driven by either the particular status or category of need that that an organization was set up to deliver. So we have a food agency, we have a health agency, we have an agriculture agency, or the category of person that the institution was set up to serve. So we have a women and children's agency, we have a refugee agency. And I think Kieran's point was perfect on this. We don't have an ability within that industry to orient our assistance to the lived experience of the people in need. We deliver it right from the top through these categories that have been pre-baked in since the 1960s and 70s, if not earlier. And that leads to these very strange, very perverse outcomes, some of which you highlighted really effectively, I think, in this report. You know, we see refugees being served differently based on whether they are in a camp or out of a camp, not based on what their underlying actual needs are. We see host populations being served very differently from refugee or IDP populations. Again, somewhat irrespective of what the parallels may be in terms of their underlying humanitarian and human needs. We see food that is being provided not necessarily based on what's dietarily appropriate to the population, but based on what is either logistically expedient for WFP or what USAID has deigned to give based on what American farmers are growing. And I don't mean that as a knock on WFP in any way. WFP is part of the system it's part of, and this is the way that we have not designed but allowed this system to evolve. And so, there are some encouraging signs in the report as well that I think get to some of the ways that the humanitarian industry is beginning to grapple with this issue. The reference to WFP of expanding cash support, that's hugely important. Cash is one of the most powerful ways to both ensure that a population can address its own needs via its own lived experience and to give them the agency and the empowerment to do so. It's also good to see in the report that WFP seems to be grappling with some of the real limitations on cash. I think cash is not a cure-all, and this sometimes gets lost in the cash programming evangelism that you see out there. But interesting to note, there is some resistance that you expressed from women who are worried that this is more prone to misuse than in-kind assistance, and that's certainly a theme we've seen across other contexts as well. noting that cash can be more or less feasible, more or less useful, depending on the local market conditions. That's another thing we've seen. We saw that in Ethiopia during the drought last year. We've seen that in South Sudan. If you have a serious supply rupture, then sending cash in will just drive prices up without necessarily improving food security. Also interesting to note, the report hones in on the fact that the refugee population is not principally asking for, or at least OTU is not expressing, give us food, give us water, give us shelter. They're saying, give us education, give us jobs. And that's something we're also seeing. The more we listen to what people actually want, the more we find that some of the things that they are asking for are not necessarily what we as a humanitarian industry are set up to provide. And none of those issues are unique to Djibouti. None of them. Every single one of those issues we have seen in South Sudan, we have seen in Jordan, we have seen in Syria, we have seen in Nigeria. I was in Nigeria a few weeks ago for the World Health Organization, went to an IDP camp outside Maiduguri, and we were looking at how health services were provided in that camp, and it was extraordinarily fragmented. So if you're a woman or a child, you go to the UNICEF clinic for a certain set of maternal child health care services. If you need GBV, gender-based violence support services, you go to a physically separate UNFPA clinic. If you need nutrition services, you go to another physically separate site. If you need psychosocial services, you go to yet another physically separate site. And if you're a man or someone who doesn't fit into one of those boxes or needs a different set of services, there are also a couple of NGO mobile clinics that provide general basic health care, primary health care. That's crazy. That's crazy. And it is not set up that way because that is good for those displaced people living in that camp. It's not set up that way because that is a good and thoughtful and useful and patient-centered way for them to access healthcare services. It's set up that way because UNFPA needs to be able to plant its flag, UNICEF needs to be able to plant its flag, MSF needs to be able to plant its flag. And again, I don't knock those agencies for doing that. They are behaving rationally within the system as it works, right? So don't hate the player, hate the game. But this is...
First time that's ever been said at CSIS, I think.
I try. We were told to be provocative. So if we want to change how that aid is delivered to be more coherent, I think we need to look harder at how we have shaped the system or shaped the industry. And so that's something when I was at AID that we thought quite a lot about and frankly didn't make nearly as much headway on as I would have liked. And for I've watched for well over a decade now attempts within the humanitarian world to better coordinate this, to get at this. This has been a live issue since at least the Indian Ocean tsunami in the mid-2000s, and that sparked the first big wave of humanitarian reform, which was called humanitarian reform. And so we've had more than a decade now of trying to redraw lines and redraw boxes without ever really touching that fundamental shape and structure of the system. And I think we've reached or are reaching the limits of what you can get through that approach without looking at more fundamental issues. What we've gotten through better coordination is not more coherence, it's better coordinated fragmentation. But you still have fragmentation. And so I think we need some more fundamental change to really get at that. A couple of the things that we launched towards the end of the last administration were a much greater focus on policy engagement around right to work and right to education for refugees. And that culminated in the summit that President Obama hosted at the UN General Assembly last year and got some really significant commitments. That's kind of a new way of thinking about our commitment to refugees, thinking not just in terms of assistance, but policy engagement with host countries and thinking about what those host countries also need to see and how we can broaden our toolkit to support that. Taking a longer-term view of the needs of protracted refugees and the new World Bank facility and the World Bank's engagement on this issue generally, I think are hugely encouraging steps and potentially game changers because they open a whole new avenue that we haven't had before within the humanitarian industry for how to deal with that. And there are some changes in how I would say prospective changes to how the humanitarian industry works based on the grand bargain commitments that a number of aid agencies made last year, which would, if they really come to fruition, take a much more holistic view of needs that is not sector siloed, but takes a comprehensive look, and then that would drive strategy that is not sector siloed, but seeks to be comprehensive. Whether that can deliver while the system is still as fragmented as it is, I have my doubts. But clearly we need to do more than we've done before, and I think we need to be more aggressive than we've done before.
So that's a really good prompt, I think, for a question I want to ask all three of you, given your comments. And that is, all three of you have mentioned in some way that we really need fundamental change to the system, that we need to break down the silos and the barriers and the categories that prevent the humanitarian community from being able to approach this challenge from a human-based way and a demand-driven way. But I also know if we had different people on the panel, they would express a lot of concern about opening up that conversation in the current political environment. So I wanted you guys to address, like, what do you think are the prospects for having that conversation? And if we were to try to prompt that conversation, would we end up in a situation that's actually worse than where we are today in terms of countries trying to dismantle commitments that they've made or protections or conventions that we currently have in place?
I can take a swing at that. Yeah, I think that's that was certainly a big point of pushback that we in the USG got from some of the UN agencies in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit last year. Because I think a number of the donors wanted to be more forward-leaning about rethinking how the system could look. And there was this refrain that became kind of famous of the system is broke, not broken. And I heard that more times than I can count from UN colleagues. And there's a bit of truth to that. I mean, clearly the resourcing of the humanitarian system is woefully inadequate, and that contributes heavily to some of the challenges and shortcomings of the system. But it's also impossible to look at the fragmentation that you see at field level and not say that something is broken with that as well. And ultimately, there is political risk in saying amidst a global context where there is greater skepticism towards aid, greater skepticism towards refugees and migrants. I think it needs to be carefully and thoughtfully handled, but at the same time, in that context, I think it's much more defensible to say, we recognize these inefficiencies or these challenges within the system, and here is the way that they can be addressed and solved, as opposed to denying that they exist when they do so manifestly exist. I think that's a much less defensible position in this political environment than trying to have a constructive agenda to deal with them.
So I agree with everything Jeremy said. I think the risks of how far we take that conversation in the current environment are not trivial.
Yeah.
And I think it's really incumbent on us to be careful which Pandora's box we open. But there are things that we can do, and there are areas where we can demonstrate success, both in terms of improved efficiency, but also improved effectiveness and changes in people's lives. And cash is, I think, a great example of that, right? Where there is a recurring kind of anti-cash narrative. There is maybe a little bit too much evangelism going on around cash and kind of rose-tinted spectacles. But we can demonstrate real changes in people's lives. We can demonstrate that people will act responsibly when given the opportunity to do so in their own best interest and their family's best interests. And we can challenge some of the established power hierarchies and incentives. Someone has to use the word incentives when talking about the humanitarian system. Within the system that forces all, Jeremy was kind enough not to talk about IRC in that camp in Nigeria, but I'm sure we're there planting our flag alongside UNICEF and MSF because that's what the system incentivizes us to do. And to the extent that we can think about specific interventions, whether it's about early childhood development, which speaks very well to the concerns people always have about education, about their children, ways that we can tangibly demonstrate improvements in people's lives by working differently. Cash is another great example. Jobs, livelihoods, kind of thinking about in places like the Middle East, where there is a different economic environment than in many of the places we've worked. How can we use private sector approaches without losing a protection lens? I keep insisting on that, but how can we use private sector approaches like special economic zones and job accelerators and job matching programs and these kinds of things to give real teeth and meaning to the compact approach, for example, so that it does generate benefits and isn't just a nice fig leaf that goes over what ultimately can become just paying people to keep refugees over there, which is something we don't want to do. So I think there's a need to go beyond the incremental in humanitarian reform, but we have to recalibrate our sense of where the risks are in the current political environment in the US, in Europe, globally.
Well, I think, highlighting the operational efficiencies and effectiveness, really underscoring innovations that are working and how to build those up or take them to scale is important. I think that the issue about getting in the middle on the cash debate and appreciate the recognition that obviously the best response for the contextual circumstances is what we're all about. And certainly where there are opportunities to be able to purchase locally or to use cash, where it makes sense, but not distorting markets or exacerbating inflation is certainly key. I know that the World Food Program has recently been going through a strategic reorientation of its country programming to really kind of move from a model where there would be different projects, maybe 3 or 4 different categories of types of assistance in one country even, to more integrated whole country programs. And also looking at how to support national governments and with an eye toward, where possible, capacity development, capacity strengthening of national governments in their own food security systems to meet the needs of their populations. And also, hopefully looking at where, one of the things I think about displaced populations that we just really have not done successfully collectively is to move away from this vision of this being a short-term problem and short-term back-to-back infusions of emergency assistance or short-term appeals for aid, rather than thinking about what we know. Really, in a sense, actualizing international frameworks, the issue of how do you support refugee or displaced populations alongside your own national population, and really trying to think about what that means. Uganda is an interesting case where, by virtue of making land available to refugees arriving, and allowing them to move toward livelihoods and getting away from the reliance on humanitarian assistance toward more self-reliance, I think is a very interesting model that should be looked at more, and how do we support Uganda in doing that. And interestingly, we just had someone in town, I think he's still here, who works in Uganda, who focuses on post-harvest loss reduction. He was working in Uganda, and now he's working also with the refugees who are in Uganda, so that even the farmers who are refugees themselves can benefit from new technology and also be able to ensure that they are maximizing their crop production and assets. So I think that to the degree to which we really kind of move away from thinking about just the short-term nature of the displacement to how do we integrate this into strategies at the national level that hopefully are also supported regionally within a region is something that we need to do more of.
Great, so we're gonna open up the floor to questions from the audience. We'll take 3 questions at a time. This is being live streamed, so you will be recorded, just so you know. And when you stand up, please introduce yourself, where you're coming from, if you have an affiliation, and please keep your question to an actual question so that we can take as many as possible. Okay, right here in the front. And there'll be microphones coming around, so just wait for 1 second.
Thank you all for coming today. My name is Diana Cayley. I'm an advisor of food security and monitoring, evaluation, and learning at Crown Agents USA here in Washington. And I love that we got this nice 10,000-foot view of all these systems problems that we're talking about. And what I would love to know is, what one single thing would you recommend for each of us in this room and those of us that are joining us online? Like if we had an action list of things to do today, what would you recommend that we do? Thank you.
Right here, up front. Jillian. Oh, right here. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Rabia. I'm with the Women's Foreign Policy Group, and I'm Pakistani, and Pakistan had a huge refugee crisis with the Afghan refugees coming in, and I feel like that's a completely forgotten issue at this point with all the other refugee crises in the world right now, and world attention and all humanitarian attention being diverted in other areas. And I feel like, as you referred to the humanitarian community as an industry, with it being an industry and with different crises coming up every day, every year there's a new problem. Every year there's refugees somewhere that need to be taken care of. How do you think that, for Djibouti, for example, where do you see all these crises in 10 years, for example? Like the Syrian refugee crisis in 10 years. Because 10 years ago, I know there was a lot of humanitarian assistance being pulled into Pakistan, and now there's next to nothing. And so that's not a sustainable way of taking care of these refugees. So you take care of them for 5 years and then gone. So what's a more sustainable way of leaving structures within the community that can help them? If you could comment on that.
Was there anybody else back here? Okay, and there's one over there in the corner. All the way over there. Sorry, Jillian, I'm making you run around.
Thank you. My name is Molly Rivera-Olds. I work in the International Organizations Bureau at the Department of State, and I worked on the President Obama's Refugee Summit last September, and I worked on Djibouti specifically, and I know that some of the commitments that were made were largely related to accrediting education, as well as working to allow refugees access to tertiary education and sitting for exams, and also passing the refugee legislation, protection legislation. When you were on the ground there, was that a part of at least the sort of the policy level discussions? Did you see progress towards implementation? And if not, sort of what were the hurdles that you saw?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Great, so we have one on what single thing would you recommend? The question about Pakistan hosting lots of Afghan refugees who are now forgotten, and how do we deal with the fact that we always have more crises, and the older ones tend to be sort of forgotten. So how can we be more sustainable? And then I'll take the Djibouti question. Jeremy was there?
Sure, I can certainly on the what one thing would you change? I don't think there is any one thing that. There are a lot of things that need to change. I think one thing that is particularly foundational to a lot of the other changes is getting it right on needs assessment and how we understand the needs of the populations that we're trying to serve in a way that is reflective of their lived experience, as Kieran said, rather than reflective of the silos within which we've built the industry. And I think if we can get that right, then a lot of things downstream from that will start to change. And if we don't get that right, then we bake the fragmentation in right from the beginning. And that's traditionally what we've done. So I don't think that will fix everything by a long shot, but fixing a lot of the other things rests heavily on getting that right, which is why it was one of the most controversial parts of the Grand Bargain during the Grand Bargain negotiations last year. On Pakistan, I would dispute that Pakistan's the refugees that are hosted in Pakistan have been forgotten. I think there's still a lot of, there are still, certainly when I was in the USG, that still got a lot of attention and focus. But your broader point is absolutely right. There is always a new flavor of the month, and new crises pop up left and right. And the issue that we have traditionally in the humanitarian system is we try to support protracted crises on one-year cycles, and you can't do that. You can't think that way and effectively support these populations. So some of the work that is now being done that IRC has helped to envision, and a report that we at CGD and IRC just launched last week on refugee compacts, this idea that donors and host countries working with aid groups should take a much longer term view of refugee crises. I think that begins to get at some of the models for dealing with these as protracted displacement situations, which in some ways look a lot more like urban slum management challenges in camp settings, than thinking of these as an acute crisis that we just renew every single year.
Well, maybe if I could comment on your answer on the one thing, on the assessments. I think there is some movement in that direction, and I think following the World Humanitarian Summit, I know that there's definitely an effort in food security assessments to bring together the resources and the knowledge of FuseNet, of the European, the best of the European food security analysts, FAO, WFP, and 4 or 5 others. And there was just issued last month a Global Food Security 2017 report, which really is a very inclusive and I would say has brought more different kind of lenses to the food security analysis than was previously done. So that's still one sector, I mean, getting to your point, but I think within the food security space that there is some movement there. So on the one thing that I would ask, this gets back, does I risk here falling into the what's broke, not broken. I do think that more predictable and certainly multi-year funding from a growing number of donors would really be appreciated. And I would just like to say, I mean, thank you for raising the point about Pakistan. I mean, I think it's incredibly important, and I know that sometimes as I'm looking at some of the global food security information, I mean, there are so many places around the world that have really dire situations and have actually been neglected. And I think on the point about, you know, assets that may be in place to support refugees, I mean, refugees typically are, well, the increasing number are in urban areas, but those who are not are usually living in the most remote and marginalized areas of countries which have not yet benefited from the sort of development investments that you do find in the urban and peri-urban areas. So to the degree to which, with a refugee influx, one thinks about how to support health and medical and educational infrastructure in a way that even after return of refugees benefits the local communities who may previously not have even had that access to that level of services or assistance is something that should be thought about.
Maybe I'll pick up on the Pakistan-Afghanistan point, and you also asked where do we see places like Syria in 10 years. So 10 years ago I was in Afghanistan. I spent a number of years there in the mid-2000s as the post fall of the Taliban optimism started to fade and the situation started to turn and deteriorate. So if I look at Afghanistan in the last 10 years, I worry that Syria is going to be 10 years from now, a place where all-out conflict may have stabilized to some degree or calcified on the ground, but where we don't see a legitimate political authority, and where we don't see services that are available to people, and where we see continued insurgency or fighting that's impacting primarily on civilians. So the question, I think, is almost how do we learn from the last 10 years in Afghanistan? And when we think about political transitions, which sadly seems like an ever-distant possibility in Syria, but when we think about that and everything that has to come after that, how do we make sure we learn those lessons? I think Pakistan, and I'm proud to be able to tell you that our largest project worldwide is in Pakistan, so it's definitely not forgotten. But it also provides a lot of examples of things that work. Again, visiting Peshawar and visiting Afghan refugees, they made a huge economic contribution to local markets in Peshawar and surrounding areas. The hospitality of the Pakistani government, Pakistani people over decades for the largest refugee population in the world sets an example that Jordan and Lebanon or others are following. But again, we see the flip side of that. We see people being pushed back in ever larger numbers to a country that's not ready to accept them, putting them at risk as well. So I think there's a lot of positive lessons and a lot of cautionary tales when we look at the Afghan Pakistan experience. In terms of one thing that I would suggest people do differently, I'd almost flip the challenge back to everybody and think about this idea of a supply side driven industry and how that determines the decisions that we make and what we do. And go back to your organizations and think about where is it that you're being driven into something that you feel is not the best thing to be doing in the interests of the people you're trying to serve and trying to reach. Where's the resistance to that within your own organization, and how can you overcome it, and think about one project that could be done differently and be used as an example within your organization and beyond to show that reform and doing things better is possible.
So on the specific question of Djibouti, we did find, in fact, that the government had made a lot of progress fulfilling those commitments because it had passed a law in January. We were there in February, so just the month prior, giving refugees the right to legally work and also the right to education. The issue is that those have to then be translated into organic laws in order to be implemented. So there was a policy commitment. I think in terms of operationalizing those commitments, there are a couple of challenges. In the Markazi camp that houses most of the Yemeni refugees, there was a lot of confusion around the situation around the school. So some of the children had been going to a school outside of the camp, but for a number of reasons that are probably too complicated to get into here, they were no longer going to that school. They had made a decision that they didn't want to access that school. They wanted a school to be in the camp. But there was a lapse because there wasn't funding for that. There hadn't been planning for that because the international community had worked out this other arrangement. So they were working through that. In the camps in the south, they do have primary schools. But what a lot of the refugees want is access to secondary and tertiary schools. The issue there is in order to access those schools within the national education system, refugees had to have birth certificates. And those who were born in Djibouti weren't automatically given birth certificates. So the government was trying to address that by issuing birth certificates to everyone born after 2013 automatically. But those born before 2013 or earlier had to apply for their birth certificate, and there was a significant backlog. So that's just sort of a logistical issue that they were working through. In terms of jobs, I think this gets to something that Debbie said, which is overall levels of unemployment are very high. So even if refugees did have access to the ability to work legally, they would still be competing with Djiboutians for limited numbers of jobs. There was a lot of desire for people to set up their own businesses, but there was an issue in terms of access to capital. So I think that's going to be, something that the country is going to continue to have to work through, where you do have a situation where overall the economy is depressed and standards of living are low, and there's endemic poverty and all these other challenges. There was a sensitivity in Djibouti, although people were very welcoming of refugees and migrants having rights or access to opportunities that the local population didn't have. So it was my impression that the government was sort of constantly trying to balance those demands from the international community to guarantee certain things to refugee and migrant populations that their own population was also demanding. So we have time for another round of questions. We have the gentleman right there.
Thank you. I'm Mr. Ismail Jama from Djibouti Embassy.
There you go.
And I thank you, the CIS, for this opportunity and to give us the chance to have an overlook of the situation of refugees and migrants in Djibouti, and to have maybe to attract the attention of the international community and the US for to improve the condition on the ground. Saying that, I read carefully your report, and you make some clarification just now when you are talking. Of course, the government of Djibouti make a lot of commitment, and we are doing our best to try to help the refugees, migrants, and the displaced population since the independence, not now. The Yemeni crisis just started 2 years ago, but we have refugee and migrants since 40 years now. And we are proud of our open door policy. We are also victim of our ambitions, because we are welcoming all these people, even if we don't have enough resources. My question is not about what your report has said about the refugees and how to improve the humanitarian system. My question is about your affirmation, because as a Djiboutian we have the sentiment that we are treated unfairly when we are welcoming the refugees, but also international community donors, the UN system. They are all present in Djibouti. They are all doing their work. Nobody tried to stop them doing their job. There is no problem for that. But saying that the government intentionally neglects its own people in the northern part of the country, I don't know where you're getting this affirmation. It's totally false. And if you have any reference of that, I would like to know. Thank you. But there is always room for improvement to help the population. The WFP is doing a great job in Djibouti. They're using Djibouti as a platform, logistical. And we are always doing our share. And we also wait the international community to do their share too. Thank you very much.
Okay, over here.
Hello, I'm Gia Cromer. I'm a PhD student at George Mason University. The question is in the general area of the system and industry, long-term solutions and sustainment. I'm wondering that exploring the refugee sustainability and development nexus and considering the sensitivities to government sovereignty and interference in sovereign states, could you each discuss, please, your various perceptions and perspectives of the longer-term solutions using governments, vice non-government organizations? And the point of that is going to the question that to begin to address the larger issue of multiple refugee, food, and humanitarian crises, moving traditional territorially based government support to stateless societies, and the concern that inadvertently we're encouraging governments to wash their hands of humanitarian issues in favor of other entities doing it for them.
My question is similar to the past one. I work for a company. We do international development projects within the realm of public health. I'm wondering if these panelists believe that the momentum and trajectory is to increase funding for these crises within the international community, to not leave host states stranded in terms of funding. I know that at the World Bank meetings last week, there was a bit of a passionate move to make sure that funding really was increased. And then if you don't think the trajectory is moving that way, what would it take and who would be the actors to push for that change?
I think we had one more.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just gonna, thanks. I'm Torsten Janus. I'm at the University of Wyoming. I was just wondering, there must be historical, because there's always been refugee populations in the world and displaced people. I mean, historically, because of wars and famines and so forth. There must be historical like success stories. Kind of, even the U.S. took in a lot of refugees, and both political and economic refugees historically. But I guess in the U.S. is maybe a little bit like I mean a better version of what Uganda may be doing, because they have. You said they made land available, and the U.S. had a lot of natural resources, so it had a lot of economic opportunities it was able to offer people. But are there like historical success stories, kind of like what countries have done that has actually worked, kind of? And have you looked at that, I guess?
Great. So we might have time to do one more after we take this round. So on the issue of the North, I don't think we were saying the government was intentionally ignoring the North, but rather, to Debbie's point, that oftentimes refugees are housed in areas where there's already a lot of challenges when it comes to food security, poverty, and the like. And multiple people that we interviewed talked about the North being particularly vulnerable when it comes to those issues, and neglected not necessarily by the government, but by the international community writ large, because it was hard to reach, particularly the areas bordering Eritrea. So difficult to reach and insecure. And so therefore a lot of aid agencies didn't go up to the North. Do you want to start with the other question?
Sure. I mean, so I'd like to actually start with the question on success stories. I think I agree with Debbie. Uganda really is a success story. I think there are very few completely unqualified success stories. There's many really positive examples you can draw on, but I'm going to pick up on one that's really close to home here in the US and the refugee resettlement program that the US government really has been a global leader in. And you can go down the road to, I'm going to shamelessly plug IRC's resettlement program here, to our offices in Baltimore and Silver Springs, where refugees who are resettled here in places like Atlanta, like Silver Springs, like Missoula, like Abilene in Texas, within a very short span of time are integrated into the communities in which they are welcomed. They're earning, they're paying taxes, their kids are in school, they're learning, and within the space of, you know, not even a full generation span, they're opening businesses and they're thriving and they're helping to regenerate city centers in places that have started to decline for economic reasons. So there are real success stories that are possible, but it takes good policy, it takes evidence-based policy, and it takes political will to maintain and sustain that. And to me, that's a really good example to go to, you know, kind of the sovereign issue of governments, of, you know, governments exercising their sovereign responsibilities under international law to offer protection and asylum to people who qualify for refugee status. And I think there are real risks of governments backing away from that for all kinds of reasons, and there is a risk in the kind of work that we all do of filling a gap. I think we're very sensitive to that, and you know, whether it's in one of the countries in which we're operating, where there's a risk of us undermining and supplanting government service delivery systems, for example, we run healthcare services, or whether it's allowing governments to essentially outsource some of their protection responsibilities or assistance responsibilities to us. You know, the alternative is to pull back and to not engage, and that's not really something that we see as an option. And I think the answer to it is to make sure that at the same time as we are delivering projects on the ground, to be building those partnerships at a policy level, whether it's with the government in Uganda, or in Djibouti or in Pakistan, or whether it's with the government here in Washington or in Brussels. And on funding trajectory, I think it's a story of ups and downs, but I fear that for the large part, the risk is that it'll be a downward story over the next few years. I think that signals from multiple governments and the impact of things like Brexit, the dynamics around aid in the UK and in other countries in Europe, as well, of course, as dynamics and signals from the administration here mean that foreign assistance levels are under threat and under question in a way that they haven't been for, I think, quite some time, despite the good efforts of the World Bank and others to try to counter that. And that's a real concern, I think, for all of us.
And Kieran, for you or for the others, on the specific question of funding, do you find that individual donations are also down? I mean, there's oftentimes stories about people having humanitarian or emergency fatigue. Are you seeing a decrease, or do you find that when images, you know, sort of make the front pages and people are shocked and horrified about what's happening, you see a spike in individual donations that could help mitigate some of the downward pressures on government budgets?
I was in a briefing yesterday. I was briefing some donors on the famine response in East Africa, and one of them pulled up their phone and showed me a World Food Programme app where they're donating to World Food Programme, which kind of annoyed me because I, you know, always hope the money comes to us, but it was a really nice app.
Thank you.
We're going to copy it. We've seen actually quite a lot of donations go up on specific issues. We've seen really positive responses relating to refugee crisis and relating to the refugee program here from public donations. But when it comes to famine in East Africa, we're not seeing the same level of response. And so I think there is an element of people seeking ways to engage both through donations and other forms of outreach that express their political and policy preferences when they disagree with those that are kind of in positions of authority. There are significant potentials in digital fundraising that I think every organization is exploring. But ultimately, while that funding source is incredibly valuable for the flexibility it gives us and the ability to respond quickly, I don't think it can ever replace the institutional funding streams that are going to allow us to go to scale and deliver sustainably, give us the predictability that we need over time.
I would say, I mean, it is alarming how the humanitarian needs, the total dollar ask is escalating. I mean, $22 billion is what OCHA is looking for this year on behalf of all of the humanitarian partners to meet the needs in 2017. I think that's more than triple what it was a decade ago. And I mean, one thing that we really haven't talked about here is, this is something that Antonio Guterres said one time when he was High Commissioner for Refugees. He mentioned that there's no humanitarian solution for humanitarian problems. And what we haven't mentioned is really we're not hearing a lot about the efforts, I'm sure there are many, but the lack of success stories, let's say, on conflict resolution and sustainable peace building at the moment is quite striking. And so while I think everyone in the humanitarian community is very willing to step up and do what they can do in support of national government efforts to address needs within their borders, there certainly has to be a similarly engaged effort to really try and find political solutions to some of these situations, which are going on and on and on. I would just say, I mean, I think on the resourcing, I agree with you totally that there's no substitute for the sort of major bilateral donors stepping up. The burden sharing issue is important. I mean, I think if you look at the OCHA, the response to the appeals and the countries that provide the resources, I mean, it tends to be a similar list year after year, although there are additional donors who do make new contributions of a sizable nature. I know there was a major conference yesterday on Yemen. I believe it was held in Geneva. And apparently there were pledges announced that meet about half of the requirements there. But the numbers of governments who are themselves donors and trying to increase that number and get them to step up to a greater share is incredibly important. But I do think in terms of individual donors and in terms of the American public, I mean, there's such a deep bipartisan, almost nonpartisan commitment to supporting humanitarian need and certainly food assistance in this country. And polls have shown that people really still feel a strong commitment in this area. And I think it's important that we somehow find that way to get the message out there about what the needs are, but not to make it seem so overwhelming or daunting that people feel that they can't make a difference because they can.
So there's an interesting synchronicity between several of these questions about what does success look like? How does this tie to the obligations of host governments? And how does that all get paid for? And those things are quite interlinked. I think if you look at where there has been success, and I agree with Kieran, I think on a very small scale, the U.S. resettlement program has done really excellent work, but that's not an at-scale solution. Larger scale solutions are like what we've seen in Uganda, and I believe also in Tanzania and some other places where refugees are given more rights. And the common theme you see across a lot of these refugee response success stories is the more that refugees are afforded rights, then the better their lives are and the more effective the support to them will be. And the more those rights are restricted, the more difficult everything else is. And so that's easier to do on a small scale in the US with the resettling in a given year under 100,000 people into a country of more than 300 million. It's much harder and more difficult to do in a place like Jordan when you've got, or Lebanon, where you've got a refugee population that is a substantial proportion of the host population. You can't scale the US model in a place like that. And so I think the challenge, and this is where the financing piece is really important, the challenge is how do we engage differently with host governments to enable them to offer those rights to refugees in a way that is compatible with their own social cohesion, social fabric in their own country. And that's a big challenge. I think some of the reforms of the past year with the World Bank and the Refugee Compacts model coming into play are trying to get at that, but it has to be financed. And the reason why Jordan is really the one success story or burgeoning success story that everyone points to is not unrelated to the fact that the US government has put massive amounts of economic support into Jordan. And it's, I think, an open question whether we can replicate that model in other places like Kenya and Uganda and so on, where we don't have nearly the level of economic support that we put into Jordan. But this question of the financing is really central to making a lot of those other pieces work. As to your question of the prognosis for the funding outlook, I am not totally pessimistic about where the US will end up. I think there has been very strong support for the humanitarian funding accounts in the US Congress, regardless of party and regardless of president. We don't know yet where this administration will come out on that. The document that leaked yesterday with some of the apparent planning figures only touched the development account, so it didn't really give a signal on the humanitarian, but it was a very draconian picture on the development side. So if it is similarly draconian on the humanitarian side, that's obviously very dangerous, but ultimately it's up to Congress. But that institutional support is the only way you get scale. It's very difficult outside of very sexy natural disasters to get money at scale for humanitarian response. And I think when I was working in the NGO sector, if there was an earthquake or hurricane or something that was on CNN wall to wall, a lot of money would flow in. But for anything else, it was much smaller scale. Not unimportant, but much smaller scale.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope you'll agree that our panel has been provocative, insightful, and very forthcoming in their analysis and in their recommendations. So please join me in thanking them, and thank you for coming.